13 letters, 13 warnings, 13 chances to stop him, and yet 13 lives were lost. Every clue was sent in plain sight, to the police, to the press, even to the victims themselves. Nobody acted, nobody believed, until the final clue arrived, and it wasn't a warning. It was a confession. The first envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the locked glass doors of the Brookdale Chronicle's small-town newsroom. The receptionist found it when she came in at 7:45 a.m., wedged awkwardly against the welcome mat, as though it had been pushed there in haste. There was no stamp, no return address, just a single word scrawled across the front in uneven capital letters. Read. Inside, on a sheet of cheap yellow notepad paper, the handwriting was jagged and erratic, letters crowding each other as if they were fighting for space. The message was brief. A woman in a red coat will be gone by Thursday. Stop it, or she will never be found. No signature, no explanation, no demand. The editor, a man with 30 years of local journalism under his belt, skimmed it once and tossed it onto his desk with the same indifference he reserved for anonymous complaints about potholes and noisy neighbors. Probably some bored kid trying to scare their teacher, he muttered. The note was never reported to the police. 2 days later, on Thursday evening, a 57-year-old librarian named Margaret Clark failed to return home from her shift. Witnesses said she'd been last seen leaving the library in her signature red wool coat. Her body was found 3 weeks later, buried in a shallow ditch miles from town. The connection was never made, at least not then. The second envelope came a week after Margaret's disappearance. This time it was delivered directly to the Brookdale Police Department, slid under the side door sometime in the night. The front bore a crudely drawn circle, and inside was another message, typed this time. The boy with the bicycle will be next. He rides alone at dusk. The duty sergeant who found it in the morning put it in a file marked nuisance letters. Nobody wanted to waste resources chasing ghost threats. 3 days later, 11-year-old Daniel Price never came home from his evening bike ride. His bicycle was later found abandoned near the old train tracks, its front wheel spinning slowly in the wind. The official narrative chalked it up to a runaway case, at least at first. His parents begged the police to look deeper. The letter was never shown to them. The third clue arrived on a humid July afternoon, this time taped to the front window of a flower shop in the middle of downtown. Written in red ink, though later confirmed not to be blood, it read, "She will not make it to her sister's wedding." A shop assistant handed it to her manager, who laughed it off and threw it in the trash. That weekend, a 23-year-old waitress named Kelly Myers vanished while driving to her sister's reception in the next town over. Her car was found by the roadside with the keys still in the ignition. The engine was still warm. By this point, there had been 3 messages and 3 missing persons. But Brookdale wasn't the kind of place where people thought about patterns. Bad things happened far away, in big cities, to strangers on the news. Here, misfortune was explained away with simpler stories. Bad luck, poor judgment, accidents. The fourth letter shattered that comfort, but only for a moment. It was mailed, actually mailed, with a proper stamp and postmark, to the Chronicle's newsroom. The envelope contained a folded map of Brookdale with a single street highlighted in red marker. On the back of the map, a date was written, August 14th. That date came and went without incident. The newsroom staff joked about how the sender had finally slipped up, that it proved the whole thing was just an elaborate prank. They didn't know that on the night of August 14th, 34-year-old Matthew Gaines was last seen walking down that very street. His disappearance wouldn't be reported until 2 days later, when his boss realized he hadn't shown up for work. Over the following months, the letters kept coming. Some were typed, others handwritten. Some contained cryptic riddles. Others were direct enough to make the skin crawl. But they all had one thing in common. They predicted someone's disappearance, and they were always right. 13 letters in total, 13 warnings that might have saved 13 lives, if only someone had believed them. In the early days, the police treated them as a nuisance. Later, they treated them as a curiosity. By the time they treated them as evidence, it was far too late. The first 3 letters, the ones about the woman in the red coat, the boy with the bicycle, and the sister's wedding, were never even cataloged as official exhibits. They were misplaced, discarded, forgotten. The most chilling detail of all came years later, when investigators finally looked back through the few surviving letters. Hidden in the chaotic handwriting and puzzling phrases were details that only someone with intimate knowledge of the victims' lives could have known. Margaret's love for her red coat, Daniel's daily bicycle route, Kelly's excitement for her sister's wedding. These weren't lucky guesses. They were the calculated predictions of someone watching, waiting, and choosing. And yet, in those early days, the warnings were treated as background noise, odd little notes in the rhythm of a sleepy town. They blended into the hum of everyday life, unnoticed until silence fell where laughter had once been. The first clue had been a lifeline, the second, a siren, the third, a shout in the dark. But no one heard. Or maybe, no one wanted to. By the time the fifth letter arrived, the notes were no longer vague warnings. They were detailed blueprints. The kind of detail you could only get from shadowing a person for days, maybe weeks. The newest message was folded neatly inside a black envelope and hand-delivered to the Chronicle's reception desk by a young boy who claimed a man outside had paid him $5 to drop it off. When asked to describe the man, the boy simply said, "He smiled a lot." Inside the envelope was a single photograph. It showed a young woman standing at a bus stop, earbuds in, her attention fixed on her phone. The back of the photo was stamped with a date and time, September 3rd, 6:45 p.m. No words, no threats, just the image and the timestamp. On September 3rd, at precisely 6:45 p.m., 29-year-old teacher Emily Dawson stepped off a bus outside her apartment complex and vanished between the stop and her front door. The CCTV camera facing the street had been spray-painted black just hours before. It was the first time the police began to connect the disappearances to the notes. But even then, the reaction was slow, tangled in bureaucracy and the fear of admitting that a predator had been playing a game in their town for months. And while they hesitated, the letters kept coming, more frequent, more taunting. The sixth note came in the form of a children's puzzle book, delivered anonymously to the local elementary school. A teacher found it in the lost and found bin. Every page seemingly untouched except one, a crossword puzzle halfway completed in red ink. Certain words had been filled in: bridge, Friday, rain, and a name, Lydia. The school janitor mentioned that he'd seen a man in a dark hood leave the book on the front steps before dawn. That Friday, during a late-night rainstorm, 36-year-old Lydia Patterson's car was discovered abandoned on Brookdale's East Bridge, driver's side door hanging open, rainwater soaking the seat. The engine was still running. She was never seen again. After Lydia's disappearance, fear began to creep into the cracks of Brookdale's calm facade. Parents no longer let their children ride their bikes after school. Neighbors stopped leaving their doors unlocked. The Chronicle began publishing the letters, the ones they received, though the police discouraged it, warning it might inspire copycats. But it wasn't a copycat. It was the same hand, the same relentless rhythm of threats followed by proof. Then came the seventh letter, perhaps the most unnerving yet. It wasn't a letter at all. It was a voicemail. The editor of the Chronicle found it on the office answering machine one morning, left at exactly midnight. A man's voice, calm, almost conversational, said, "3 days. She works at the diner. She hums when she pours coffee." The line went dead. 3 days later, 24-year-old waitress Hannah Lewis disappeared during her late-night shift. Security footage showed her stepping outside the diner's back door to take out the trash at 11:57 p.m. She never came back. The trash bag was later found, ripped open, contents strewn across the alley. By now, the killer's pattern was undeniable. The letters weren't simply warnings. They were announcements. They came like clockwork, and each one hit its mark. The police formed a task force, but every attempt to predict the next move ended the same way. Too late, too far behind. The notes were no longer merely describing future victims. They were flaunting details only the killer could know, weaving them into riddles, photographs, and audio recordings that all ended the same way, with a missing person. The eighth clue arrived in the dead of winter, a small cardboard box left on the steps of the police station. Inside was a snow globe. When shaken, tiny flecks of glitter swirled around a miniature model of Brookdale's old clock tower. Taped to the base was a slip of paper that read, "When the hands reach 12, she will stop breathing." The officers staked out the tower on the given date, posted at every corner. Midnight came and went without incident. Relieved, they called it a false alarm and began packing up. At 12:07 a.m., A call came in from a security guard at the shopping plaza across town. A woman had been found collapsed in the parking lot, unconscious. She was later pronounced dead. The coroner estimated her time of death at exactly midnight. Her watch, found on her wrist, had been tampered with, its hands glued in place at 12 o'clock. The killer was no longer just sending warnings. He was orchestrating performances, each one more elaborate than the last. The town was his stage, and the victims were chosen as much for the drama of their disappearance as for the act itself. The 9th and 10th letters arrived almost simultaneously. One was a postcard depicting a carnival, with the words, "She will not see the fireworks," scrawled across the back. The other was a single page torn from a romance novel, with every mention of the word kiss underlined in red. The task force split its focus, unsure which clue pointed to the real target. By the time they realized the two messages referred to the same woman, a carnival vendor who also worked part-time as a bookstore clerk, she was already gone. Brookdale was unraveling. The streets that once felt safe became corridors of suspicion and fear. Every stranger's face was scrutinized, every abandoned object treated as a potential clue. And yet, even with the killer's pattern laid bare, even with resources mobilized and watchful eyes on every corner, he stayed ahead. He seemed to know where the police would be, what moves they would make, almost as if he had someone feeding him their plans. By the time the 11th letter came, it no longer mattered whether anyone believed them. They had become something more than warnings. They were the killer's signature, proof that the game was still his to control and the clock was still ticking. The 12th letter never came. For months, the rhythm had been unbroken, a warning, a disappearance, a hollow investigation, and then, without reason, silence. It was almost worse than the threats. Without the letters, there was no way to predict the next move, no pattern to cling to. Every day felt like walking through a minefield, every stranger a possible predator. The police were stretched thin, chasing tips that led nowhere. The Chronicle kept its front page open for the next message, but it stayed empty. Winter turned to spring, and with each passing week, people began to convince themselves it was over. That maybe the killer had moved on, or been caught for some other crime, or simply grown tired. The task force disbanded. Security patrols were scaled back. The streets slowly filled again with the sound of children playing. Doors were unlocked once more. Then, on an unremarkable Tuesday morning, the Chronicle received a package. It was heavier than the usual letters, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. No return address, no postage. It had been dropped off in person. The receptionist noticed the faintest trace of perfume on the paper, though she couldn't explain why it made her uneasy. Inside was a stack of envelopes. 13 of them. 12 were exact replicas of the original warning letters, each sealed in clear plastic as if preserved for a museum. The handwriting, the photographs, the riddles, all identical to the originals the police had collected. And one envelope remained, thicker than the rest, labeled simply, "The Last." The Chronicle editor opened it in front of two reporters. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink neat and deliberate this time. "You had 13 chances. I gave you every one. You failed. Now I am done." Beneath the message was a list of names, 13 in total, each one belonging to a confirmed victim. Next to each name was the date of their disappearance. The list ended with one more name. The name belonged to Detective James Harrow, the lead investigator on the case. The date written next to it was that day. Within an hour, Harrow's phone went unanswered. Officers were dispatched to his home. His car was still in the driveway, coffee cup on the kitchen counter, front door locked from the inside. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry, just absence. The revelation shook the town more than any of the previous murders. Harrow wasn't just a detective. He was the symbol of the investigation, the man who had promised at every press conference that justice would come. To have him vanish was to strip away the last illusion of control. For the first time, the police admitted what many had feared. The killer wasn't simply a shadow slipping through the cracks. He was someone they had been standing next to all along. Someone with access to evidence, to schedules, to information no outsider should have known. The letters had never been intercepted. They had been allowed through. 3 days after Harrow's disappearance, the Chronicle received one final package. Inside was a small wooden box. The lid was carved with the image of a typewriter, its keys pressed mid-sentence. When the editor opened it, he found an old cassette tape and a Polaroid photograph. The photo showed Harrow, seated in a chair, his hands bound, but his face calm, almost resigned. In the background, faintly visible, was the Chronicle's newsroom. The tape was worse. The killer's voice was unmistakable, calm, measured, almost bored. He spoke as if dictating a letter. 13 letters. 13 chances. Not one taken seriously. You called them pranks. You called them games. You filed them away in cabinets and trash bins. I watched you laugh over them in the newsroom, ignore them in the squad room. I stood beside you while you read them, and you never looked twice. You were all part of it. Every shrug, every delay, every excuse. I gave you my confession 13 times, and you never heard it. So now I give you the last. There was a pause, followed by the sound of footsteps moving away. Then, faintly, Harrow's voice. It was you. The recording ended there. Police scoured every inch of the Chronicle building and its surroundings, convinced the photograph meant Harrow had been inside at some point. But no fingerprints, no fibers, no trace of him or the killer was ever found. The newsroom staff swore they hadn't seen a thing. The investigation was reopened, this time with the unsettling awareness that the suspect list could include anyone, a neighbor, a coworker, a friend. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone knew what the letters had proven. The killer wasn't just watching from a distance. He had been here, in the rooms where decisions were made, close enough to touch. Months passed without another disappearance. The Chronicle's front page carried the victims' names in black ink, a silent memorial. But behind closed doors, no one believed it was over. They had learned by now that silence didn't mean safety. It meant waiting. Some nights, the editor would stay late, sorting through the preserved letters, tracing the handwriting with his eyes. He would find himself wondering which moment had been the closest, which interview, which casual conversation, when the killer had been standing right there, smiling, knowing he was already writing the next name on the list. No one knows what happened to Detective Harrow. No body was ever found. But the 13th envelope, the last, still sits in an evidence locker, its plastic seal unbroken, its message preserved in perfect ink. It isn't the original, of course. The killer still has that. And somewhere, perhaps only a street away, he's waiting for someone to open another envelope.